Okay, good afternoon. Well, for us in the UK, and good day to the rest of you from around the world. Welcome to our second fully online Peter Sowerby colloquium in philosophy and medicine. Perhaps I should say, for people who don't know, a little bit about what the Peter Sowerby Foundation is and the project we've got going at King's. So Peter Sowerby was a British doctor, a GP, who designed some time ago a computer system to manage his GP's practice, and soon he found that he was selling it to other GP practices, and became one of the most widely used computer systems in the UK National Health Service, and he made a load of money from this. And being a very good person, as doctors mostly are, he decided to put this money back into doing good things, one of which, and a very good thing indeed, is promoting interconnections between philosophy and medicine. And in particular, he funded this Peter Sowerby Philosophy and Medicine project at King's, part of which is the chair I occupy, the Peter Sowerby Professorship of Philosophy and Medicine. Anyway, so we do lots of things, in particular in teaching, but also in research that connect philosophy and medicine, connect philosophers and medics. And one of our activities, most enjoyable activities, is this colloquium that we have. And hitherto that's always taken place in London and had a small but enthusiastic following. And now we're able to expand our activities across the world. So it's going to be particularly exciting to hear what Justin Garson has to say in a few minutes' time. My deputy Harriet will introduce him in a few minutes. Harriet, can I hand over to you to introduce Justin and to chair this session?
Sure, thanks, Alexander. So yeah, as Alexander says, it's really great to have Justin here today. We're big fans. So Justin is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Hunter College and Graduate Center at the City University of New York. So Justin is known for his work in philosophy of biology. In particular, he's done really great work on biological functions and had a really cool book out last year, which everyone should definitely go and read if they haven't already, on biological functions. So he's also done really interesting work on sort of more applied stuff in philosophy of mind and philosophy of medicine, taking into account these kinds of theories from philosophy of biology. And some of what he's been writing about is the relationship between psychiatry and psychiatric disorders and dysfunction or biological function. So I'm hoping maybe we'll hear a little bit more about that today. So I'll hand over to Justin.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I just finished up a book manuscript by the same title as the talk. So it's Mad by Design, Rethinking Psychiatry Outside Dysfunction. And I have to admit that I'm still at that stage where when I got this invitation, I wasn't entirely sure what to put in and what to leave out. I don't yet have a clear principle of selection to help me decide what to talk about. So I'll try to give a synopsis or précis of the book. I hope it won't be too disorganized. I'll do the best that I can. Often, I think when philosophers and historians think about the history of psychiatry, it's easy to think about it as if it involves little more than a kind of clash or confrontation between two major worldviews, the biological worldview and the psychological worldview. So people say things like, You know, in the 1970s, we entered into this biological era with psychiatry, the era of psychopharmacology. But before that, we had Freud and the psychoanalysts, and then we were working within a psychological era. But before that, we had an era known as German Imperial Psychiatry, and they were working within a biological paradigm. Before that, we had the moral treatment of people like Pinel and Tuke, and they were working within a psychological paradigm. And in fact, some historians have described the history of psychiatry as little more than a kind of pendulum swinging back and forth between these two perspectives. So today I want to recommend a different kind of distinction. And this is the distinction between what I call madness as dysfunction and madness as strategy. So in the following, I have two main goals. First, I'll set out the distinction in a somewhat more abstract or conceptual way. And then I'll give a sketch as to how one might try to write the history of psychiatry from the vantage point of this distinction. Now, one legitimate question that might have occurred to you is, look, Justin, you're a philosopher, you're not a historian. We know what happens when philosophers try their hand at writing history. We often get bad history of science. So is that what you're doing? You know, bad history of science? And that's a fair question. And I've thought about it a lot. And I've concluded that I'm not trying to engage in history of science, nor am I even trying to engage in what's called conceptual genealogy, where you try to explain why a certain worldview is so entrenched by looking at the past. Rather, I'm involved in what I call a recovery mission. It seems to me that this idea of madness as strategy has always been part of psychiatric thinking, but it's somehow buried, and it's hard to see it for what it is. So my goal is to engage philosophically with various texts from psychiatry's history in the hopes of explicating or unearthing this alternative point of view. And then once we have this alternative point of view very clearly before us, then it's another tool in our conceptual toolkit. So whether we're philosophers trying to philosophize well about mental illness, or whether we're historians trying to write new stories about the past, or mental health professionals thinking about different paradigms of treatment, or even service users, somebody who's been diagnosed as having a mental illness and just trying to think through, okay, what does this mean for me that I've been diagnosed with a mental illness? Okay, and then finally, let me just say a brief word about the term madness. It's probably unnecessary in this group, but some people have said, look, that seems like a pejorative term. Why are you using this pejorative term? Again, that's a fair question. And I use it for two reasons. First, it was important for me to find a term that doesn't have a medical connotation, unlike mental illness or mental disorder. It doesn't presuppose that this phenomenon we're interested in falls under the jurisdiction of medicine. And then secondly, it seems to me that there's a number of recent advocacy groups made up of people who are service users who have been diagnosed with mental illnesses. And my sense is that the term is being reappropriated by some of those groups, as in the Mad Pride movement. So I'm hopefully using this term in a way that's both without medical connotations and without pejorative connotations. So let me try to begin by explicating this distinction in a more abstract way. And I'm now moving to my slides. Okay, here we go. Look at that. Right, here's the two things I want to do: explicate the distinction and then sketch psychiatry's history. And I'll begin with madness as dysfunction, because I think it's the more familiar of the 2 points of view. The basic idea behind madness as dysfunction is when someone is mad, there's something, the basic premise is that when someone is mad, there's something inside of them, in their mind or in their brain, that isn't doing what it's supposed to do. It's not performing its function. It's not doing its task. And the basic approach to treatment is to try to figure out which part of the mind or brain has failed and to fix it. So in order to deploy this paradigm, you need to have at least a very rudimentary inventory of what the basic faculties of the mind or the brain are. You attribute functions to these various faculties, and then you infer that when somebody is mad, then at least one of these faculties isn't doing what it's supposed to do. Now, this madness as dysfunction paradigm, it's not new. It doesn't go back to the 1970s, and it doesn't even go back to the middle of the 19th century. It goes back to Hippocrates. In the book On the Sacred Disease, the author is very clear that the various forms of madness result from a disruption of airflow in the body. So the basic picture is you have all these different veins. Their job, their function is to draw air to the different parts of the body that need it. And when these veins can't perform their function because they get clogged up with phlegm, that's when you get madness. I actually think, however, that the clearest and most concise statement of this madness as dysfunction viewpoint actually comes from Comte. When Comte was young, he wrote a short essay, somewhat satirical, somewhat serious, called Essay on the Maladies of the Head, 1764. And he first divides up the mind into these three categories. He says, you have experience, you have judgment, and you have reason. And then he infers on the basis of this that you can only have three kinds of mental disorder. I mean, metaphysically, there can't be more than three kinds of mental illness, and each mental illness happens when one of these three faculties fails. So when the faculty of experience fails, you get one kind associated with hallucinations. When the faculty of judgment fails, you get another kind associated with delusions about other people's beliefs. And then when the faculty of reason fails, you just, a person in that condition you just can't communicate with them at all. This dysfunction paradigm is very central to a lot of, at least in the English-speaking world, a lot of the textbooks in the 19th century, people like John Haslam or Benjamin Rush or Joseph Cox. It's taken for granted that in order to do psychiatry, you begin with an inventory, even a very rough inventory of the basic faculties of the mind. And then you try to figure out in any particular case of madness, which faculty has erred. The basic paradigm is presupposed, again, in this period that historians called German Imperial Psychiatry, running from about Griesinger to Kraepelin. The basic idea stated clearly is that mental disorders are just different dysfunctions of the nervous system. And then finally, it seems to me that this is the worldview that's embedded in both the DSM and RDoC systems of classification. So the DSM-3 tells us right at the outset that here's what it says. Each of the mental disorders is conceptualized as a clinically significant behavioral or psychological syndrome. And in addition, there's an inference that there is a behavioral, psychological, or biological dysfunction. So this is, the DSM appears to take this as a kind of organizing principle for psychiatry. Similarly, Thomas Insel, former head of NIMH and proponent of RDoC system, tells us very straightforwardly that one of the basic axioms of the RDoC framework is this. He says, RDoC conceptualizes mental illnesses as brain disorders mental disorders can be addressed as disorders of brain circuits. So this is a worldview with real history, with real longevity. So in that light, what would be this alternative paradigm? What is madness as strategy? And the basic idea behind madness as strategy is this: when somebody is mad, everything inside of them is working exactly the way that it's supposed to. Everything's performing its function, everything's doing its job. So madness, as the title of the presentation it says, is by design. And one implication of that is that in order to do psychiatry, the first question you're asking is, okay, what purpose is being served here? What goal is being served? What end is being served? What function is being performed? And I think the clearest statement of this point of view that I've come across in the literature is through one of Freud's early advocates, Harry Stack Sullivan. And he says, in each particular case, this is your job as the therapist. You must understand what the patient is trying to do. What's the goal here? What's the purpose? And so I'm going to develop this idea, and I'm going to do so using a autobiographical remark, a kind of context of discovery remark. I first came across this kind of idea. I was in graduate school, and I had looked at the work of some of the evolutionary psychologists who are interested in psychiatry. So you have people like Randolph Ness or Vivek Glover or Peter Gluckman. I guess you can call it evolutionary psychiatry. I mean, there's a textbook called Evolutionary Psychiatry, so I guess that's a thing. And more often than not, when somebody from this background looks at a certain mental disorder, the first question they ask themselves is, what evolutionary purpose does this serve? Or what evolutionary purpose might it have served in our past that explains its current existence? So for example, Randolph Ness has this idea that depression serves the evolved function of helping us to detach from unrealistic life goals. More recently, Vivek Glover writes about how some of the anxiety disorders she thinks have the evolved function of helping us cope with a potentially hostile environment. She actually thinks there's something like a developmental switch early on. So if the child, or even at a fetal stage, if you realize that you're in a hostile environment, the switch goes to the on position, and then you become a highly anxious, even a clinically anxious person, because that's your best shot at remaining vigilant to potential dangers. And when I read this work for the first time, I had two reactions. And my first reaction was, oh, this is adaptationism. This is the stuff that Gould and Lewontin warned us about. It's just a bunch of just so stories. I don't like that kind of thing. That was my knee-jerk reaction. And it should. I mean, if you're a philosopher of biology, your first knee-jerk reaction should be, wait a minute, this is adaptationism. I don't know how I feel about that. But then that reaction ran its course. And then I had a second reaction, which was that, you know, these people are doing something absolutely revolutionary and even subversive. They're doing exactly what the subtitle of my book encourages us to do. They're rethinking psychiatry outside of dysfunction. They're trying to think about what it would be to understand a mental disorder without invoking the concept of dysfunction or defect or deficit or what have you, just in terms of function. And so the next question I had was, well, who else has thought this way? In other words, has anybody else in the whole history of psychiatry ever had this wild idea that some mental disorders have functions or purposes? And the first name that popped into my head, and maybe this name popped into some of your heads too, was Freud. Here he is. one theme that runs throughout all of Freud's work from the beginning is that almost any particular mental disorders, I think he had a handful of exceptions. Maybe neurasthenia was an exception. Maybe some kinds of anxiety were an exception. But as a rule, any particular mental disorder has a twofold purpose. Its purpose is to prevent the mind from becoming aware of certain forbidden ideas or forbidden desires, while at the same time fulfilling those desires in a somewhat distorted or a symbolic way. I'll just say that again, it's such an important point for Freud. Almost any particular mental disorder has two purposes: protect the mind from becoming aware of a forbidden idea or desire, while at the same time partially fulfilling it. And he has this remarkable early paper in 1894 called The Neuropsychoses of Defense. So this is early. This is before the Oedipal complex, before his major theories. And there he says there are three main types of mental disorder. There's phobia, there's obsessions, and there's hallucinations. And he says that each represents a different strategy that the mind uses for, partially fulfilling this, this forbidden idea. And so that's when I came up with this label, madness as strategy, just to denote whatever it is that both Freud and the evolutionary psychologists have in common. And then, of course, I thought to myself, well, who else in the whole history of psychiatry has had a view like this? And I just began to scour a lot of the traditional and important texts in the history of psychiatry, looking for instances of this alternative paradigm. And that's where the book came from. So let me move on. I think the best way to clarify and illuminate this idea is just to dive right in to give a sketch of psychiatry's history from the point of view of this distinction, and to show how this idea has arisen repeatedly, but in different guises or in different forms. So if you don't have an organizing principle like this, madness as strategy, then it's hard to see them all as exemplifying the same kind of paradigm. So I'll begin somewhat arbitrarily with Robert Burton. And of course, he wrote this massive textbook, massive book, first published in 1621, The Anatomy of Melancholy. And Burton tells us right at the outset that all madness is from God. All madness is either caused by God or it is allowed by God. So he puts this teleological or purpose-centered view of madness he sets it out right at the beginning. And in fact, he says that each form of madness has two purposes. One, God is punishing you for something that you've done wrong. But secondly, God is trying to offer you an opportunity for redemption. So there's these two different purposes. There's this punitive purpose and this redemptive purpose. And those purposes for Burton mirror the two attributes of God's character, God's justice and God's mercy. God's justice implies that you have to be punished for your sins, but God's mercy entails that you're going to be punished in a way that gives you a chance at redeeming yourself. And I think, for Burton, the kind of paradigm for all madness is Nebuchadnezzar. And if you remember the biblical story, you have this king of Babylon, and he's created this vast city. And one day he says to himself, look at what my hands have created. This is all going to glorify me. And at that moment, God strikes him with madness. And for 7 years, he thinks that he's a donkey or some kind of a beast of the field, and he eats grass in the field, just like the other beasts. But then 7 years in, he comes to his senses and he says, look at this terrible thing that I've done. I've made myself equal to God, when really God sees me more like a beast of the field. He comes to his senses, and then everything's right again. I think Burton sees old madness as having that general structure. Another feature of Burton's work that I just can't dive into right now is I think that for Burton, madness it's not just a punishment, but it's actually each form of madness is a portrait of the sin that gives rise to it. So, for example, he talks about maniacal fury. And he says, maniacal fury must have come from the sin of anger and unforgiveness. So the idea is you're angry, you ruminate on your anger, you refuse to forgive the way that you're supposed to, and over time this anger becomes crystallized, it becomes constitutional, and that's just what maniacal fury is. So maniacal fury can be seen as a kind of exaggerated, as a kind of grossly exaggerated portrait of ordinary anger. And it's almost as if, in his view, God uses that portrait to draw your attention to the specific sin that you're supposed to repent of. Okay, another thinker that has a very strong teleological and theological orientation was George Cheney. Of course, his 1733 treatise, The English Malady. And he accepted this point, that all forms of madness have this twofold character, both of punishment and an opportunity for redemption. But for Cheney, the sin that loomed largest in his thinking was intemperance, or immoderation in food and drink. And you might think, well, why was that? Of all the things people do, why was immoderation such a cornerstone of his thinking? And I actually have a theory about why he thought that way. But I think you'd actually have to read his entire corpus to find out why. Interestingly, most of his works are actually works of natural theology. They're not works of medicine. But one of the things that's remarkable about his work is that he's convinced that when a person begins to rebel against God through their intemperance and through their immoderation, God has designed us, and he calls this an infinitely wise contrivance. God has designed us to have a whole series of progressively severe warning signs to let us know that our lives are off track. So initially, after some immoderation, you might feel indigestion, bodily aches and pains. And then if you don't turn your life around, then later on, you're going to feel fatigue, lethargic. And then if you still don't turn your life around, you might sink into a very profound depression, lowness of spirits, and so on. And these are all warning signs that God has put in us to help us turn our lives around. Okay, so as I said, by the time we get to Comte and his youthful essay, I see Comte as really going against this tradition and really forcefully asserting what I'm calling this madness as dysfunction paradigm. And as I said, this was also a common theme in a lot of the 19th century textbooks. John Haslam is a great example of that. Nonetheless, throughout the 19th century, we still find these very interesting expressions of the madness as strategy paradigm. And one somewhat interesting and unusual thinker here is the German physician Johann Christian August Hine Roth. I think he was the first chair of psychiatry in Germany. And he has this textbook that he wrote in 1818. It's a massive textbook. It's about 800 pages long. And much of it reads like has a fairly conventional medical orientation, even a Kantian orientation. It's almost like a calculation. He says we have these three faculties of the mind, and each one can err in three different ways. And so you have these 9 possible major categories of mental illness. But at one point, a couple hundred pages in, he starts describing this one form of madness, and the English translation has it as insanity with dementia and rage. And the idea is this: in this kind of madness, you have a person who's been traumatized. They've just been subjected to terrible things again and again. And so at a certain point, the person just withdraws from reality and enters a kind of imaginary world of hallucinations and delusions. And he's very clear that this is a coping strategy. And he has this remarkable line where he says, in the best of cases, let me go back one. In the best of cases, this is actually part of nature's healing mechanism. This is the way that nature is trying to. And here's the quote. He says, in the best of cases, this disease acts as a storm which clears the atmosphere, a wholesome desire of nature to cure a perversion through another perversion. So the idea is you have the perversion of your intellect is part of nature's strategy to cure this other perversion, namely the perversion of the repeated terrible things, traumatic experiences that have been happening to you. But one way he differs from people like Cheney or Burton is that he's not thinking of this purposeful character of madness so much in theological terms, but rather it's as if nature itself, has this kind of inherent tendency toward healing. So he's thinking about it more in this kind of vitalistic way. Another thinker who has a similar approach to Hine Roth is Philippe Pinel. He too has a very teleological orientation. Of course, it's often said of Pinel that he was the one that liberated the mad patients from their chains at the Basset Hospital after the French Revolution. And he wrote a treatise in 1800. Like Hine Roth's, much of the treatise has a pretty standard medical orientation. But at one point, he describes this particular form of madness, manie périodique, and it's something like periodic bouts of mania or periodic bouts of fury. And as he describes this, he begins to speculate about whether these bouts of mania are part of nature's healing mechanism. And he has one particular chapter, and you can imagine I jumped up and down with excitement when I saw the title of this chapter. Chapter 3, it's called Motives for Regarding Most Bouts of Mania as the Effect of a Salutary and Favorable Reaction for Healing. And to support this conjecture that this manie périodique has a healing function, he describes these 5 young men who were all admitted to the Basset, and he says their intellectual faculties were obliterated, but each one of them in his own time had one of these episodes of mania, and then their intellects recovered completely and they were able to go home. Now, I mean, I don't know if that's true. It seems suspect to me. It just seems like such a remarkable story. But at any rate, my point here is that Pinel certainly thought that some of these kind of maniacal attacks had a healing or cathartic character. And he actually goes so far as to liken himself to Georg Stahl. This is the early 18th century physician. And one of the things that Stahl was famous for was the idea that fever itself isn't a disease. Rather, it's part of the healing mechanism. It's part of the way that your body tries to heal disease. And at one point, Pinel actually says, I'm very much like Stahl, just like Stahl thinks that fever isn't a disease, but part of the healing mechanism. So too do I think that these attacks of mania are not part of the disease, but the healing mechanism itself. Like Hine Roth, I don't think that Pinel is really thinking so much in terms of the purposes of God, but somehow he's thinking of these purposes as woven into the very fabric of nature. He's thinking that nature itself has some kind of an intrinsic healing tendency. Excuse me. And one thing that's very important here, it's important to see that Pinel's view has implications for his ideas about treatment, about therapy. The most important implication is that when somebody's having one of these episodes, you actually don't want to stifle it. And this is a piece of advice that really runs contrary to a lot of the thinking of his time. So if you look at John Haslam gives several ways for stifling these attacks of fury. Haslam says you can medicate, you can use medications, you can use restraints, you can put these individuals in dark rooms, anything you need to do to stop these attacks. And Pinel says, why would you want to stop these attacks? These attacks have a healing property. What you really want to do, he says, is to just provide a kind of safe context for these attacks to run their natural course. And at one point he uses this analogy. He says, when you have a doctor who's trying to bleed a madman, a patient, I wonder which of the two is more mad, the patient or the doctor, for trying to stifle these attacks. Finally, not finally, I'm almost there. Finally, we reached this era of the German Imperial Psychiatry, people like Wilhelm Griesinger. And here, as I said, you have the view that mental disorders are dysfunctions of the nervous system. It's a straightforward commitment to what I'm calling madness as dysfunction. But still, you find these traces of teleology in Griesinger. It's as if he wants to have a purely dysfunction-centered view of madness, but he can't quite do it. And in particular, he has this very interesting passage that Freud later cites very approvingly in the interpretation of dreams. He has this passage where he says that if you actually look at the content of delusions, delusions like dreams are typically wish fulfillments. There's clearly some kind of a coping mechanism at play here. So for example, he uses an example of a young woman who's been stood up at the altar, and she forms the delusion that the groom is still waiting for her. Maybe he's gone away or gone into hiding. He's just waiting around for her. He says these delusions clearly are coping strategies. Okay, where am I? All right, finally, of course, we get back to Freud. And as I see it, Freud is vigorously, we can read Freud as vigorously reasserting this earlier teleological madness as strategy position. As I said, as a rule, he sees mental disorders as having this twofold purpose: to protect you from becoming aware of a forbidden desire, and at the same time to fulfill that desire in a roundabout way. And also, as I noted, he has this 1894 paper, Neuropsychoses of Defense, where he describes the three major forms of madness, each of which represents a distinctive strategy that the mind uses to fulfill these purposes. I want to turn, however, to two of Freud's followers in particular, who I think in some ways are more interesting. And these people working in the 1920s and 1930s, Frieda Reichmann and Harry Stack Sullivan, both American, working in the United States, actually working in the greater DC metropolitan area. And they were both trying to employ Freudian insights for the treatment of schizophrenia. And both had this very strong madness as strategy orientation. And so I'll start with Frieda Reichmann. Unfortunately, her greatest claim to fame, I think, is that she coined this awful expression, the schizophrenic mother, the idea that schizophrenia is usually due to bad parenting and particularly bad mothering. And this is unfortunate because one of her biographers pointed out she actually only uses this term once in her entire corpus. And her actual theory was far more subtle than that. She didn't actually think that the mother was typically or always to blame. But the basic idea was this, that you have a person with schizophrenia and they're retreating to an inner world because they faced repeated episodes of rejection, usually by a parent. And so this retreat into an inner world is a kind of emotional buffer to prevent themselves from getting hurt anymore. And this basic idea as schizophrenia as a kind of retreat was the cornerstone of her whole treatment. Her whole treatment consisted of this. You, as the therapist, are supposed to just be a warm, approving, non-rejecting presence in the patient's life. You just hang out with the patient, and she thought that over time, in the best of cases, they'll eventually come out of their shell. When they realize that you are not a rejecting presence, eventually, they'll come out. And all the things that they do, they throw things or that they curse at you or talk nonsense, that's all just part of this meticulous strategy that they've built up to, scare people away. Her colleague, Harry Stack Sullivan, had a similar but somewhat different approach. He thought of schizophrenia as a kind of healing journey in which the person regresses to an infantile state for the purpose of reincorporating large masses of what he called dissociated personality traits. So the idea is that as you're growing up, you express certain personality traits, like maybe tendencies toward anger or tendencies toward sexuality, and they provoke such disapproval in your caregivers that you just dissociate them. You shuttle them off into this amorphous realm of what he called the not me. But as you get older, the fact that you have all these dissociated personality tendencies it makes you psychologically unstable. And so schizophrenia, and he thought specifically what's called the catatonic or catatonic type of schizophrenia, is like a retreat back into infancy to reincorporate these dissociated contents. And some of you in this connection might have thought of R.D. Laing. Laing talks a lot this way about schizophrenia as a kind of healing retreat into the inner world. He actually was a big fan of Harry Stack Sullivan. He was a big fan of Frieda Reichmann. So he talks the same way, schizophrenia as a kind of healing inner journey. The idea that your goal as a therapist is to be a kind of guide and shepherd along this journey. Okay, so I'm starting to wrap up now, but I want to say something briefly about the DSM-1 of 1952. Everybody recognizes that the DSM-1 was deeply impacted by Freudian and psychoanalytic ideas, but I think there's a very specific way in which it was impacted by psychoanalytic ideas, and that's that the whole document is thoroughly teleological. It adopts what I'm calling madness as strategy. So, for example, DSM-1 divides up all of the major, what it calls the non-organic mental disorders. It divides them up into these three categories: the psychotic reactions, the psychoneurotic reactions, and the personality reactions. And it very explicitly defines each one as a different sort of strategy for dealing with inner and outer stressors. So, for example, it describes the psychotic reactions as those in which the personality and its struggle for adjustment to internal and external stressors utilizes severe affective disturbance, profound autism, and withdrawal from reality, and or formation of delusions and hallucinations. So at root, these three major categories of mental illness are just three different coping mechanisms. There are three different strategies that we use to accomplish our goals. And it seems to me that one of the core missions that the DSM-2 and the DSM-3 have, in other words, one of the core missions of the DSM-2 and the DSM-3 task force is to eliminate this whole language of teleology from the DSM franchise. So by the time that you get to the DSM-3, as I said, all of this language of psychosis as a coping mechanism, all the very expression of psychotic reaction, as if it's some kind of a reaction to an environmental or inner stressor, all of that's been eliminated. And what you get, as I said earlier, is a very clear statement that mental disorders are just a bunch of inner dysfunctions. No more, no less. We're done with this whole talk of strategies, goals, and purposes. But in my opinion, and this is where I differ from some of the people who have written about the DSM-3, I don't see the DSM-3 as primarily a biological manual. I don't see it as some kind of insidious attempt at a biological takeover of psychiatry. Rather, I see it as an attempt to assert this madness as dysfunction point of view. And one indication of that, among others, is that right at the outset, it tells us that all mental disorders are dysfunctions, but it's not committed to there being biological dysfunctions. It says they could be behavioral, psychological, or biological in nature. So I see this as a way of saying, look, we're willing to be pluralistic so long as you knock it off with this talk of strategies and stick to this talk of dysfunctions. And then finally, as I said, you reach these evolutionary psychologists who are interested in psychiatry, people like Ness, who thinks of depression as a evolved mechanism for detaching from unrealistic life goals, or Vivek Glover, who thinks of anxiety disorders as mechanisms for remaining hostile. There are some who have written of aspects of schizophrenia as having some kind of a functional component to them. So, for example, the cognitive behavioral therapist Aaron Beck writes of some of the negative symptoms of schizophrenia, like mutism, not speaking to anybody, as a coping strategy for fears about social world. Or some have written about delusions as functional responses to perceptual abnormality. So the idea is that you have some kind of a low-level perceptual dysfunction, and in order to cope with that dysfunction, you create a whole network of delusions, and the delusions are actually, they're performing the function. They're helping you to navigate this strange new world. And so one of the consequences that I hope to show is that this approach, this evolutionary approach, isn't new, or it's not brand new. It actually just represents the most recent manifestation of a very traditional way of thinking in psychiatry. It represents what I'm calling madness as strategy. It's kind of framing madness as strategy in our evolutionary and Darwinian era. Okay, one more thing, just give me about 2 more minutes. I know there's been a lot of material, but I do have some ideas about, what are the implications of this distinction for thinking about philosophy, or thinking about history of psychiatry, or thinking about, maybe even thinking about treatment, but I'm going to stick to philosophy because I'm a philosopher and that's what I do best. Let me just describe one particular implication. We've seen these attempts over time. I think in the DSM you have this, certainly among philosophers, to try to analyze the very concept of mental disorder in terms of the notion of dysfunction, even though the notion of dysfunction is thought differently, slightly differently by different people. So people like Jerome Wakefield or Christopher Borse have tried to do this. And from my point of view, this represents a complete misreading of psychiatry's history. What they're effectively doing is they're taking this one somewhat narrow, peculiar tradition, madness as dysfunction. They're trying to universalize it. They're trying to present it as if that's the only logically coherent or logically conceivable way of thinking about what mental disorders are. And so I think one very straightforward consequence of my distinction is to show that those kinds of attempts are quite mistaken. And thank you so much for listening. All right, let me